Thanks, Karen, and welcome everyone to the Elder Justice Decision-Making Capacity Symposium. We are thrilled at this turnout and thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to help us think about this important and challenging topic. Decision-making capacity permeates deeply, but imperceptibly, into how older adults interact with and are oftentimes treated in the civil and criminal context in courts. Over the next 3 days, we're going to try to peel away some of those layers and learn more about that. Today, we will focus on the science, the clinical approaches, and the ethics of assessing decision-making capacity. Then, on Wednesday and Thursday, we will focus on how these issues arise in the civil and criminal contexts. One of our goals is to enhance the collaboration among elder justice professionals who address elder justice issues. And that's reflected in the agenda. As you'll see, our agenda includes today 2 prominent lawyers and policy experts, Charlie Sabatino and Nina Cohn, a physician who's involved in patient care as well as research, Dr. Jason Karlawish, and a panel of leading clinicians with varied credentials in psychology and medicine. Please read their impressive resumes and bios in the materials. Now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our first speaker, the Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta. Associate Attorney General Gupta has led many offices both within the government and outside. She supervises the Office of Access to Justice at the department, as well as other litigating components, including the Civil Division and the Civil Rights Division. She also oversees the grant-making components within the department. She has devoted her entire career to the civil rights of all Americans and is a strong supporter of elder justice as well. We are very grateful that she has taken the time to help us kick off the symposium. And with that, Associate Attorney General Gupta, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, for that warm welcome and really, truly for all of your work as the Department of Justice's National Elder Justice Coordinator. I want to also thank the Elder Justice Initiative and the Justice Department's Office of Legal Education, the Civil Division's Office of Training, and our many federal partners, especially the Department of Health and Human Services, who helped to plan this remarkable symposium. I also want to thank all of our participants and panelists, and I am delighted to welcome all of you to the department's first ever Elder Justice Decision-Making Symposium. Under Andy's leadership and collaboration with so many different parts of the department is committed to using all of its tools to ensure that older Americans receive the support and protections they deserve. Every year, millions of older Americans are abused, neglected, and financially exploited, often by those who are entrusted to care for them. And the department has aggressively pursued justice for elders in a wide variety of fields, from nursing homes that provide grossly substandard care to guardians and others who abuse their positions of trust, and to multinational fraud schemes that target older adults. The department's also formed strong collaborative relationships with state and local law enforcement and provides trainings and webinars on elder abuse and financial exploitation to hundreds of civil attorneys, prosecutors, judges, investigators, and other elder justice professionals in multiple disciplines to ensure that they can appropriately respond to the specific needs of older adults. This symposium addresses a foundational part of our work to protect our nation's older adults, ensuring that they have access to justice and that they are treated with dignity and fairness. Advocates, prosecutors, law enforcement officers, judges, clinicians, and others have repeatedly reported that too often older adults are being denied a full measure of justice, in part because of mistaken assumptions or inadequate assessments of their capacity to make decisions for themselves. These assessments can have deep and lasting impacts on the lives of older adults. In the criminal context, these assessments may be critical to ensuring that justice is obtained for older adult victims and through restitution in certain cases that they're made financially whole again. For example, an older adult may be a critical witness to a crime that won't be prosecuted if she is deemed incompetent to testify. Perpetrators who target older adult victims may seek to manipulate them, and a victim's decision-making capacity may affect their interactions with their abusers. Assessing the victim's decision-making capacity can help law enforcement tailor investigations to identify those cases that may initially appear to be cases involving a consenting adult, when in fact the victim did not or could not consent. In civil cases, assessments about the need for a guardianship or conservatorship may govern an older adult's ability to make core life decisions: where she can live, what medical decisions she can make, how she can spend her hard-earned money, with whom she can develop friendships and find companionship and love and community. Those of us who work in the legal system need to have a deeper understanding of how to address the specific needs of older adults and how to appropriately assess an individual's decision-making capacity in a given case. As we work to combat elder fraud and abuse, we have to equip ourselves with the knowledge and tools to ensure that we protect their rights and pursue justice when they've been victimized. And that's honestly why I'm truly excited that all of you have joined us for this symposium. Over the next 3 days, we will be engaging in a robust conversation about how we can best serve and protect older adults in this country. Participants span the spectrum of experts, including professors, clinicians, researchers, judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officers, aging services and social service professionals, administrative officials, and many others. Although you come from many different fields, we are all here because we share a deep commitment to supporting and protecting older adults. Your diversity of experiences is critical. It's really through the cross-sectional expertise that you all bring that we're going to be able to have a fuller understanding of how to safeguard the rights of older adults. We need clinicians to help legal professionals, judges, and adult protective services officials understand what capacity can and cannot tell us about an older person's abilities. And we must ensure that the tools used to assess decision-making capacity are valid and reliable. Clinicians and elder justice professionals also need to share common understandings about their respective roles in the legal system. And I hope that we can learn how to enhance communication between and among clinicians and elder justice professionals. Finally, this symposium will explore how misconceptions about aging and decision-making capacity impact our civil and criminal legal systems. We need to confront and dispel negative stereotypes about the cognitive and decision-making capabilities of older adults. Even when a person has been diagnosed with a cognitive disability, we must understand how to reliably assess their actual decision-making capacity and how that capacity impacts the outcomes of a specific case or prosecution. This symposium is just the beginning of the work that we must do to ensure that all of us, judges, prosecutors, advocates, academics, researchers, guardians, adult protective services, aging services, and social service professionals, understanding of how aging and decision-making capacity impacts older adults, so that civil and criminal legal systems honor the rights of older adults and provide them with the greatest autonomy possible and protect those that have been abused, neglected, or subjected to financial exploitation. So thank you again for sharing your vision, expertise, and leadership as we forge forward together in pursuit of justice for our country's older adults. Thank you.
Thank you, Associate Attorney General Gupta, for those inspiring remarks. We have heard your takeaways, and we will work towards those goals during this symposium. Next, I'd like to bring on Charlie Sabatino. Charlie needs very little introduction. Charlie has been the director of the American Bar Association Commission on Law and Aging for the past 30 years and just left a few months ago to pursue other endeavors. There isn't an elder justice professional in the country who hasn't been touched by his work and his leadership. He has been a lifetime champion for the rights of older adults on many issues, but particularly capacity issues and advanced planning for incapacity. There is no one better to help frame our discussion for the next few days. Charlie, thank you for joining us and for agreeing to introduce Dr. Karlawish when you're done. Charlie, the virtual mic is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, to everyone. I'm delighted to help lead off this program on a topic that is of critical importance to anybody who works in the field of aging or disability. And what I'm going to do is provide a very brief overview with a bit of humor, but serious humor, to condense just about everything you're going to hear over the next 3 days. And what I will do is condense the topic into a set of 10 principles or maxims. Now, I had a version of this in the form of 10 commandments. But recently I saw a very interesting documentary by Ken Burns on the life of Benjamin Franklin, which provided a remarkable portrait of the man, both his gifts and his flaws. At his time, he was the most well-known, internationally well-known American of his time. And one of his most well-known popular writings was Poor Richard's Almanac, that provided a mixture of seasonal weather forecasts along with practical household hints, puzzles, and other amusements. And the Almanac became especially known for its aphorisms and moral observations that Franklin delivered with a wry, understated wit. So I imagined the key elements of this topic today, how they might be captured by Poor Richard's Almanac. So here are 10 maxims that you'll find the speakers expanding upon, adding to as we go on. And I'm going to cover them relatively quickly, starting with number 1. The lawyer who fails to presume capacity fails the client. Now, since many or most of you are lawyers here, you know that as a legal and ethical matter, capacity of all adults must be presumed. And under international legal standards also, persons with any kind of disability enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life. But it is a principle that is often easy to fall into overlooking. So this is number 1 for an important purpose because it is the first one you should always remember. Number 2, welcome family, but talk to the client alone. Now, you know, there's nothing in the lawyer's ethical rules that says you have to talk to a client alone, but it is the only way that you can clearly identify the client, get a sense of their abilities, hear what their own version of what their wishes are, unencumbered by the presence and influences of family members. Many adults, older adults, will come to see a professional, a lawyer or other professional with other family members. So while you want to be welcoming to everybody, it's really important to talk to the client alone for part of the time. Number 3, to support a client's capacity is to invest widely. Often overlooked, I think, are strategies to enhance clients' capacities, and sometimes these are the most simplest things of ensuring that the audio environment and the visual environment is helpful to somebody with low vision or poor hearing. But the range of other supports that an individual may benefit from really is limited only by your creativity. And certainly the concept of supported decision-making has become a very leading focus of thinking about capacity today, and that's for a good reason. Number 4, thou should never worship any one standard of capacity. There is no universal standard of capacity. Guardianship laws have different languages of capacity standards in them. Court cases on specific tasks have different ways of describing standards of capacity. Standards have changed over the years as cultural norms and scientific understanding has changed. And clinical approaches to capacity can vary by discipline, by the testing modality. It's really the depth and breadth of the assessment that really is the earmark of a good quality assessment. So never worship any one standard. Number 5, only the hasty covet the mini mental status exam. Well, in addition to the mini mental status exam, which you probably all have heard of or even used, there are a variety of other cognitive screening tests out there. And the important thing is to realize, yes, they are screening tests. They do not constitute a thorough and complete evaluation of one's abilities or capacities, but they are often given too much weight and considered conclusive, and that, I think, is something we want to avoid. And lawyers in particular, since we are not trained in the clinical application of these tests, we should really avoid them unless one has the thorough clinical training to know how to use these tests. Number 6, thou should never end any query with the word capacity. Yea, the proper query shall be capacity to do what? Now, think to yourself how often you have talked about capacity and ended a sentence with the word capacity. Develop the rigor, or at least I try to develop the rigor to always make sure I'm talking about the specific task that is at issue, because there may be several different tasks or abilities that are at issue, and they're not all equally impaired or abled. So one may have, for example, incapacity to make an important medical decision, and yet still have the capacity to know that they need help and have someone who they trust to help make medical decisions, and therefore could be able to appoint a healthcare proxy, even though they lack the capacity to make healthcare decisions. So it's very helpful to separate out all those threads in any discussion or assessment. Number 7, a true assessment seeks the big picture with all its variability, intermittency, and nuance. Each of us presents a unique and challenging and complex constellation of abilities and limitations, operating within a cultural context, social, biological, and environmental context. And assessing capacity requires grasping all those threads in a holistic way and bringing them together. That's not easy to do, but a true assessment truly tries to seek the big picture with all those elements taken into account. Number 8. This is a tough one for many of us. Honor thy client's own considered or habitual standards of behavior and values, not standards and values held by you or others. It's really hard, if we're honest with ourselves, to put aside our own values, our own perceptions of appropriate behavior and functioning, and really look at the person with an objective eye. A person's deviance from behaviors considered socially acceptable or rational is not a valid standard for assessing capacity. It's really that person's own lifelong habitual standards and behaviors that are most important. For example, let's call her Mrs. Jones here. She may come across to the clinician or to the lawyer as someone who's behaving socially inappropriate, is unrealistic in her expectations, and is inconsistent in her behaviors. Well, that may be a product of an underlying brain disorder, or it may be embedded in her lifelong personality and way of behaving for ages. One doesn't know that unless you have a little bit more background of this individual. That's often why third-party input on someone's history and their behaviors is really critically important. When you meet somebody or the clinician encounters somebody, particularly in the hospital setting for the first time, they don't know any of that. It takes work to find out the big picture. Number 9, honor that client's confidentiality and autonomy, even in the face of incapacity, excuse me. It's very easy to slip into talking with family members, for example, when you're dealing with a client who has diminished capacity, because you can get things done much quicker. The communication goes faster and more smoothly, but it is a big mistake because it is putting the client, the individual, in the at the bottom rung of the ladder. They should be the one who's leading the charge, and that takes more time, more effort, and more attention on our part. But even the model rules of professional conduct for lawyers in Rule 114 includes a provision that allows an attorney to break confidentiality as a protective action if the criteria for taking protective action is met. That should be taken as a very high bar, though, and not overstepped very easily, especially if one is in the position of representing proceeding. And I would argue that you would never break confidentiality because that would violate your role as the zealous advocate of that individual in that particular legal meeting. It's the plaintiff's obligation in that setting to bear the burden of proof, and the respondent's attorney's job is to essentially hold their feet to the fire to make sure they meet their burden of proof, not to help them meet that burden by sharing information that may be disadvantageous to one's client. And finally, number 10, and this is probably the best take-home point to remember. The best plan for maintaining capacity is to plan for incapacity. Now, as a society, we're not very much big into planning in so many ways, which bears out in whether you're planning for financial matters or personal matters or whatever. But many of the problems and challenges posed by diminished or declining capacity can be met by planning ahead. Support networks ahead of time. It means rearranging one's environment to be able to meet one's changing needs as they age. And it may include supportive housing. It may include, and should probably include appointing decision makers under power of attorney, possibly a trust, depending upon one's situation. Now, there's no such thing as fail-safe planning, that's true, but it really can go a long way because it's very hard to step in and try to retrofit one's living arrangement or support network after crises arise. So these are my reimagined 2022 version of Poor Richard's Almanac. And I think you'll hear these themes restated and added to in a variety of different ways as we go on. But I hope some of these will stick in your memory as we move ahead. So now I'm going to change roles here and be an introducer of a longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Jason Karlawish. Dr. Karlawish is a professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and a co-director of the Penn Memory Center. We've had the opportunity to take on some very interesting projects in the past that I won't fill the time with to describe to you. But I do want to mention that he has published a wonderfully engaging book this past year on the scientific and culturally convoluted history of Alzheimer's disease and what its impact has been on families, its place in the politics of research, and what we may expect in the future. So, true to form, Jason will be talking about advances in aging brain research and its relevance for decision making. So I see that I'm giving you a couple extra minutes, Jason, so I'm sure you'll be happy to do that. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Charlie Sabatino. It's so great to see you, and my only regret is that we're not live and in 3 dimensions, but just 2. And yet, of course, it's allowed us to have a great audience. Greetings all, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you so much to the Department of Justice for hosting, for convening this gathering. I'm Jason Karlawish. I'm a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania. I help run the Penn Memory Center, where I diagnose and treat patients. If you want to learn more about me and my work, you can visit my website there. And if you're a Twitter user, by all means, we can connect. It's a real opportunity here to talk about the advances in aging brain research. and its relevance to decision making with an audience such as you. And I am so thrilled as a physician, law enforcement, law, adult protective services, and the justice field. I'm a site investigator for some trials, no relevance, I think, at all to what I'll be talking about today. Once upon a time, but not too long ago, a physician in the United States of America could write this letter and get it published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. As a radiologist who's been sued, I've reflected earnestly on advice to obtain informed consent, but have decided to take the risks without informing the patient and trust to God, judge, and jury rather than evade responsibility through a legal gimmick. Once upon a time, in 1971, the Journal of the American Medical Association would publish such a letter, and a physician would dare to write it. So I guess my message at the beginning is a message of hope. Look how far we've come from that kind of sentiment uttered by a physician with respect to a fundamental ethic to respect the autonomy of adults, namely to obtain their consent. And so I think our challenge today, though, is to show how the science of how we understand the diseases that cause problems with giving consent and the ways we assess capacity have advanced, but still take hope from how far we've come from 1971. And why have we come so far? Well, I think this chart illustrates it. On the x-axis on the bottom there are years, 2 centuries worth of time depicted. And what this is a chart of the frequency of words appearing in the English language. And I've highlighted 2 words as they've appeared in the English language over the last 2 centuries, 200 years. In the blue is the word beneficence, and in the red is the word autonomy. And I'd like you to see how from 1900 on, that word exploded in its use in our lexicon. And so the respecting autonomy is actually a fairly contemporary one in the arc of human history. And we know this because as late as the 1980s, it took an Associated Press special report, Guardians of the Elderly, an ailing system, declared legally dead by a troubled healthcare system. This was a comprehensive Associated Press investigation of the system for guardianship in America. And what it exposed essentially a system that had reduced guardianship to no more than a rubber stamp procedure, meaning no capacity, no attention to the rights and processes. That was 1987. And I'd like to say the fact that we are gathered here today, convened by the Department of Justice, the kinds of individuals of the 689 who are on this call, show how far, again, we've come. My mission is to help us go even farther. At the same time that that article was published in the Associated Press, in the American Journal of Psychiatry was this publication of tests of competency to consent to treatment. And it would be the beginning of a rich field of scholarship that went from something that you just sort of know it when you see it, which meant you really didn't know what you were talking about, to a field now that has developed methods to assess decisional capacity. And in his excellent brief talk, Charlie Sabatino's 10 commandments, if you will, nicely laid out much of what I'll be talking about today. And they represent the kind of progress that's been made at the intersections of law, medicine, and psychology, better improve how we think about what we talk about when we talk about capacity and how we assess it. Another key event in the arc of human history, again, not too long ago, is depicted here. Again, on the x-axis are years. This time it's just the last century, the 20th century. And again, a frequency count of 2 words appearing in the English language. The first word by the dark line, indicated by the dark line upsloping, is the word Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's or variations on that. And the second is the word caregiver. And I hope what you can see is that prior to 1980, neither of those words were used much at all. So again, this recognition that there are diseases that impair a brain's ability to make decisions, as well as there are methods to assess a brain's ability to make a decision, are all very recent in the arc of our culture, in the arc of our law. And so again, we're making great progress, and I think we should be very hopeful. All right, my mission for the rest of my talk today, having given you that historical rounding, is to talk a bit about what we know about the aging brain, in age, in health, and in disease, and how we go about deciding that a brain is beginning to suffer signs and symptoms of the disease that's impairing its cognitive abilities, and then to tie all that together with the progress we've made in understanding how to assess decisional capacity. So let's start with some fundamental basic definitions and ideas. What do we mean when we talk about cognition? Cognition is just an overarching term that captures the various behaviors that a brain does. Behaviors like learning and holding on to information, otherwise known as memory. Behaviors like attaching utterances to the meaning of thoughts, otherwise known as language, or multitasking, otherwise known as executive function. I do not expect you at the end of this talk to know what those various cognitive domains are, but to simply respect the fact that there are multiple different ways to describe what a brain does when you use the language of psychology. But what do we mean when we talk about cognitive aging? What we're talking about is how cognition changes, those various abilities that are on that slide there, over time, in the absence of disease, in the absence of disease. So I take a group of adults and I say, none of you have a disease of the brain. And so anything that changes in your cognition over time reflects not disease, but aging. Now, of course, as standards for what counts as a disease of the brain change, it follows naturally, sensibly, that standards for cognitive aging change as well over time. And that is the case, actually, as to how we measure cognitive aging has changed as we change the way we measure disease. The fact is that over the years of our lives, from about the age of 30 onwards, we do observe changes in cognition in the absence of disease. And this slide here, very schematic, simply tries to show the significance of those changes over time. That white line there is just simply showing you the effects of cognitive aging, subtle until later in life, after about the 7th or 8th decade, becomes quite more noticeable. In contrast, what I've simply tried to depict is the changes seen with AD, ADRD, our current clunky, admittedly, term to describe Alzheimer's disease and other diseases that cause an older adult to lose cognitive abilities. And we now conceive of those diseases as fitting into 3 broad bins. Alzheimer's can cause someone to have dementia, meaning disabling cognitive impairments. Alzheimer's disease can cause someone to have mild cognitive impairment, meaning inefficiencies in day-to-day life because of cognitive problems. And all these diseases can be present before there are any symptoms. That is to say, in an asymptomatic stage we now call preclinical Alzheimer's. I've said Alzheimer's, but I've tried on the slide to indicate that there are other diseases that impair an aging brain's ability to remember, think, decide, utter language, negotiate space. Diseases like Lewy body disease, frontotemporal lobar degeneration, aggressive supranuclear palsy, etc. The key pearl is that the changes that occur in an aging brain because of disease are not always caused by Alzheimer's. In fact, there are many different diseases that cause a brain to develop mild cognitive impairment or to develop dementia. All right, lots of terms out there. Let's go back to cognitive aging very briefly, because with cognitive aging, what I want to convey is that over time, as depicted on these 2 graphs, 2 broad things happen. One doesn't happen, or if anything gets better, which is our crystallized intelligence. In the absence of disease, as we gain more years of life, we tend to learn more things. You're doing it right now. You're leaving this talk with all kinds of new information, more crystals, if you will, of intelligence. And as you can see by that scatter plot, it does increase over time. But what does decrease over time in the absence of disease is what's called fluid intelligence or fluid abilities, our ability to process new information in novel situations, to think and solve, particularly under time pressures. Over time, that does decline, although I hope you see from that scatter plot that some individuals late in life perform quite well, but others perform quite poorly. It's the overall change that the line is showing. I kept those dots in there, again, to emphasize the variability. It's so important that you don't stereotype aging to be a universal decline in crystallized intelligence. It is so important you recognize the variability. And yet, you have to respect that change does happen. The mission to respect a client, a patient's autonomy, is to assess the person as an individual. And Charlie gave you lots of principles to guide that. Okay, a couple more points about the diseases that cause cognition to change with aging. First of all, two pearls. One, memory loss, the complaint that of, quote, my memory is not that good, is a very non-specific symptom. It could be memory loss, meaning someone's information, distract them for a while, ask them what was it I taught you, and they say, I don't remember. But it could also be troubles with language, with doing things, or with focusing. My job as a clinician is to sort that out, just that. It's not your job if you're not a clinician focused in this area. But I'm very cognizant that when I hear memory loss, it's not always memory loss. The second is it's a simple actuarial fact. The older the patient, again, I'm going to talk about patients. The older they are, the more likely you are to see cognitive impairment. Meaning if you're dealing with individuals who are over 75, 80, 85, 90, there's a good chance that there's going to be some cognitive impairment. Maybe by cognitive aging, mild though it may be, but we'll talk more about its significance, or by a disease. All right, let's go dive down into some terms I've already thrown out there, but I think are important to clarify their definitions. First of all, the term dementia. Dementia describes a syndrome, like congestive heart failure or pneumonia. What do I mean when I say syndrome? What I mean is it's a set of signs and symptoms, problems, if you will, that can be caused by many different diseases. So when we think of congestive heart failure, you can have congestive heart failure because you've had a heart attack, because your aortic valve is failing, because you've had an infiltrative cardiomyopathy. I could run that list down and down and down. So too is dementia. You may have disabling cognitive impairments because of Alzheimer's, Lewy body disease, late, progressive. I could go down a long list. The job of the clinician is to sort that out. Disabling cognitive impairments describes cognitive changes that are interfering with someone's ability to do their usual and everyday activities that they used to be able to do without much of a problem. Managing money, using transportation, paying bills, organizing their medications. Disabling cognitive impairments. That's dementia. Mild cognitive impairment is a fairly neat recent term. It was coined in 1999. And it's gained attention like wildfire because it captures a very real clinical phenomena, although one that's oftentimes hard for clinicians to pick up. Namely, a person has changes in cognition. Others notice it or they notice it, but they don't yet have disabilities. They're still doing okay, but they're more inefficient. It takes longer. They may make mistakes, but they catch them. That's this concept of mild cognitive impairment. Also, a syndrome. You could have mild cognitive impairment caused by any of the diseases I listed. You could have mild cognitive impairment as well caused by other problems that aren't necessarily a brain disease, like sleep apnea, for example. Those are the two terms of art that are out there, dementia and mild cognitive impairment. Why do we care about mild cognitive impairment? This graph from that paper published in 1999 that first described the concept, the construct of mild cognitive impairment shows why. And all that graph is showing you, the big gray bar on the far left there, that's depicting 100% of the people at time zero with mild cognitive impairment. And on the other side, where you see more you can divide between gray and black, that's describing how over about a 48-month period of time, half the people with MCI develop dementia. So having MCI is concerning because people with MCI are at increased risk of developing dementia, depending, of course, on what the underlying disease is. So that's why we care about MCI. Let me just give you a little bit of the basics about a workup for cognitive impairment, where we are right now in the 21st century. We're looking for declines in cognition that interfere with usual and everyday activities. And we take this idea of usual and everyday activities for this person quite seriously. So a very common and important grounding question in an interview of a patient and their family member is, what's a typical day? And in that narrative of a typical day, we're focused on the instrumental activities of daily living, the ability to manage money, medications, use technology like the telephone, use transportation, whether that's the car, bus, bike, or whatever it may be, to go from one place to the other. And we ask questions about cognitive skills, and I won't belabor them in the second bullet. And the reason why we talk to a family member, in addition to talking to the person, the patient, is depicted on this graph, which shows here that if you ask people with diagnosed Alzheimer's disease, dementia caused by Alzheimer's disease, how they're performing on measures of function, I think what you can see by that flat line there is that they report fairly stable abilities. In contrast, the white circles that show a steady decline show how the family members over the 24 months of this study clearly show changes in someone's ability to do daily function. And so that's why when we work up cognitive impairment, we're very keen to give what we call collateral information from a friend or family member or data from technology someday that shows us that someone's experiencing functional decline. It isn't the case that patients don't notice their function decline, but it is the case that oftentimes they underestimate its true severity on their daily life. Which is why you need a knowledgeable informant, a friend, a family member who can tell you what's going on. I mentioned here, talk to your practice manager, because in many settings where people's brains encounter the world, where their brains are having impairment, the folks in that world will pick it up. They'll say, yeah, he keeps on calling back, asking the same question, etc. Charlie already mentioned this. We're enamored of our measures. We like our measures of cognition. They're useful, but they have their limits. So measures like the mini mental state exam or the 3MS or the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, made famous by our last president, or the St. Louis Mental Status Exam, known otherwise as the SLUMS, are all ways to measure in a fairly efficient way a general sense of someone's overall cognitive abilities. They're useful for staging and measuring the severity of overall cognitive impairment, but they have their limits, and I'll show you on the next slide some examples of that. These are two examples of a mini mental state exam score of 27. Top score is 30. If I hear someone has a 27, I may conclude with that knowledge alone that they may have cognitive impairment, but I also may conclude that they just had a bad day of test taking and there's not much to worry about. And that's because if you look closely here, here's Mr. Jones, who has a mini mental of 27. He lost 3 points on the recall measure. That's concerning. In contrast, Mr. Smith, orientation to place, 4 out of 5. He probably didn't know what the county was if he was in a clinic. Who knows what counties are in some areas. 2 out of 3 on the instructions, which is often a common little mistake. And then pronunciation, he has a bit of a lisp or what it might be, so he didn't quite correct that this 27 and that 27 are two very different 27s. You don't know that until you look closely at them. So we love our scores. They can be helpful, but they're only one small piece of information, and small at that. That's why we call it the mini mental. All right, we're gathered here today because we care about the well-being of older adults. And one of the ways we help older adults exercise their well-being, preserve their well-being, is they need to have some wealth. This is my patient, Arthur Packle. Behind him is his wife. I can say their names freely and openly because they said them freely and openly on the front page of the New York Times, where they were profiled in the story, Money Woes Can Be an Early Clue to Alzheimer's Disease. The article in the New York Times documents the sad story of what happened. The bottom line is I diagnosed Mr. Packle when he had a mini mental, I think, of 28 or 29. But he had clearly made mistakes with his finances, clearly made mistakes over and above how he used to perform. We'll talk more later about how the system could have detected that earlier. It makes sense that money woes are an early clue. Managing money is hard. It's a cognitively demanding activity. So it makes sense that as cognition begins to change, it's one of the spots where you might often pick up troubles troubles with cognition, given the challenges of managing money. Which takes me to a more detailed discussion of instrumental and basic activities of daily living, otherwise known as functional status. The stereotype of dementia is someone who has difficulties managing bathing, dressing, grooming, feeding, toileting. That's the stereotype of dementia. Envisioning someone, if you will, in the late stages of the disease, because in the later stages of dementia, people do have troubles with bathing, dressing, grooming, feeding, and toileting. They do. But that's the latter few years of the disease. The majority of the time, those problems function are problems with what's known as the instrumental activities of daily living, otherwise known as the IADLs. And I've listed them there. And I hope when you look at them, as quotidian as they seem, they're actually really important activities for someone to be them, to be me, to come home and say, I want dinner. Will I cook or will I go out? And if I go out, where will I go? And when I go there, what will I order? Or will I cook at home? All those things that are part of our self-expression of who we are operationalized in this quotidian idea of instrumental activities of daily living. And they're what's affected early and relentlessly in the course of these diseases. Diseases like Alzheimer's, Lewy body disease, vascular disease of the brain. Early on are impairments in instrumental activities of daily living. Now, when we exercise a functional task, we really tap into two sort of broad bins of cognition, if you will. This slide's a bit of a busy slide, but give me some time on it. Let's start from the bottom. First of all, it's made courtesy by my good friend and colleague, Nate Sprung. At the time, he was at Cornell. Now he's at McGill in Canada. Here's a functional ability, financial decisions. That's what Arthur Packel had impaired early and relentlessly in the course of his illness. Troubles paying the condo fee. Also troubles managing his business, such that he lost nearly all of their wealth because of some bad financial decisions. Well, if you back up a financial decision like paying a bill, it taps into two broad bins of cognitive ability. One are our cognitive abilities, namely, I talked to you already about our fluid intelligence and our crystallized intelligence, our knowledge. And that leads to our ability to do calculations. But another side of our ability to do a decision, make a decision, is our social cognition, or our social abilities, our ability to appraise a situation as trustworthy or believable. Based on that, to make a judgment. And it's this combination of social cognition and cognitive abilities that together allow us to make a decision. We're very good at measuring cognitive abilities, and we're pretty good now at measuring capacity as it's influenced by cognitive abilities. And I'll talk more about that. We're less good right now as a field measuring social cognition, but I can tell you we often know it when we see it as impaired. But that's where we are at this stage when we think about what someone's ability to make a decision. It taps into their cognitive abilities and their social cognition, if you will. Of course, then if you throw problems of cognitive aging and neurodegeneration in, it impairs cognitive abilities. It impairs social cognition to the degree that people either make miscalculations or they make bad judgments and therefore make poor decisions and become victims of exploitation or bad decision making or fraud. And so this is a very important 2x2 table that kind of puts together your world and my world. In the end, but we all want to be adults living independently. And that doesn't mean independently, meaning not with other people. It just means we choose who we want to be interdependent with. And one way we become interdependent is if we need help, right? So for example, imagine that you have, we look at the ability to sort of manage an activity of daily living, like paying bills. And is someone able to do that or not able to do that? And we make those judgments a lot in my clinical practice by interviewing the family, by talking to the patient, et cetera. But a second question, which is more what you all care about, and I also care about it too, but in your world especially, is are they able to decide how to manage that functional impairment? So there's really two decisions at work here, if you will. Is the person able to do it? And are they able to decide how to manage if they have a problem? And so you could think about how these two axes combine into this 2x2 table. So if someone's able to perform an activity of daily living and they're able to decide how to manage it if there was a problem, arguably they're living independently. So for example, suppose it's the ability to manage finances and you're someone who does a checkbook like I still do, but then you suffer a devastating injury to your hands. You can't use your hands to balance your checkbook. Well, I would say, well, I need someone else to take up my pen, if you will, and fill it out in front of me, and I'll do it with them and say, that's right, good, okay, sign that, good, okay, that goes off. So I have impairment, but I can solve the impairment. I I have capacity to do it and to solve it if there's a problem. In contrast, so that's this box down here. Another scenario is someone who, I'm sorry, jumping through my thing. So I have impairments because I've hurt my hands, and I'm able to solve how to manage it. I'm dependent, but I'm okay. I have capacity. The challenge is this group right here. I'm having impairments in managing my finances, but I'm having impairments in solving how to get help. That's the group we care about. And that's the group we want to care about when we assess capacity. So let's talk now about capacity in greater detail. How do we assess decisional capacity? What is it, et cetera? So let's start with what we talk about when we talk about capacity. Charlie said something extremely important, and I'll say it again, and you'll see it again. Capacity to do what? In other words, never end a sentence with capacity. Capacity describes the continuum of decision-making abilities. And so when we say someone has adequate capacity, we mean we've made a judgment that they have adequate decisional abilities. And we can put the decisional abilities into we categorize them into 4 different categories. The ability to understand information, appreciate it, reason through information, and express a choice. Understanding is the most common decisional ability recognized in the law as essential to the judgment that someone has adequate capacity. And understanding describes the ability to comprehend the meaning of information. Meaning you've gotten facts, you've learned them, and you know what those facts mean. I won't, for the rest of my lecture, describe what the other decisional abilities are in the interest of time. But I would say a pearl for you is, if you care about capacity, you should know what the decisional abilities are and have a working idea of what their definitions are and how you would go about assessing them. Charlie mentioned that there's no one standard of capacity. And I want to endorse his point doubly. So depending on the decision someone faces, capacity is assessed specific to that decision. In other words, never end a sentence with the word capacity. Instead, end it with the sentence of capacity to do what? Capacity to manage finances, because, for example, you're having trouble managing them, and so you've solved how someone else is going to manage them. So when I think about assessing the decision abilities, I always think about a plan for how I'm going to assess someone's understanding for the decision at hand. And I use a series of open-ended questions like, can you tell me in your own words what is the reason why you need help with your checkbook? Can you tell me in your own words what are some ways you could get help managing your bills? So in other words, I'm asking open-ended questions to get an open-ended answer to the person's ability to know that information. I'm not asking them some sort of metric measure, but what I am listening to when I hear their answers is how well do they understand that information. Charlie pointed out, and let me reiterate, that the process of assessing the decisional abilities begins with the assumption that this adult has the ability to understand the information, or appreciate, or reason through it. The default is they have capacity until you've shown otherwise. And I want to reemphasize that assessing capacity is not cognitive testing. It's not a mini mental. It's open-ended questions that assess someone's ability to understand, appreciate, and reason.
Oh, but how did my voice?
There's someone on the line needs to be muted. Charlie said it's about the capacity to do something. To do what? And indeed, since that work done in 1987 that I showed you on those earlier slides, we have made tremendous progress in developing instruments to assess the decisional abilities for specific decisions. This list here is not exhaustive. It's intended, though, to show you that if you give me a decision, I can develop an instrument to assess someone's capacity to make that decision. For example, there are instruments that assess someone's capacity to make a treatment decision. They assess their ability to understand, appreciate, and reason through the information needed to make their treatment decision for their health care. Very specific instrument. These instruments all have a common theme, though. They're typically interviews, asking people open-ended questions and requiring the interviewer to make a judgment about the answer the person gave. They are not metric instruments like simple yes/no questions where yes is correct or no is wrong or whatever it may be. They can be scored based on the judgment of the interview. And so in some sense, I view all of these instruments as guides for structuring a conversation with an individual, as opposed to some sort of very metric set of questions like you do in cognitive testing. They're useful guides to structure a conversation. Now, we've used these instruments in my lab and others' labs to measure someone's decisional abilities. And now, wait a minute, I thought you said they're conversational guides. What does this measure? Well, you can score someone's answers as being adequate, marginal, or inadequate. And for each question you ask, if you give that score and you ask, say, 10 questions, you can get as much as a 20 because you were adequate on all 10 answers, or as little as a 0 because you were inadequate. And so it is possible to convert the interview into a metric measure. And I'm showing you this here, not to obsess about the scores and the numbers, but to see what my research and the research of many other investigators in the field have shown. This is a group of 48 people with Alzheimer's disease dementia. It's mild to moderate dementia caused by Alzheimer's. And this is a matched group of caregivers, people who are assisting them in activities of daily living, making decisions. And what I've shown here is how they scored on a measure of understanding. In this case, we used one of those measures of the ability to choose a treatment. And we converted their answers into a score. And I think what you can see here is that in general, the caregivers do pretty well on that measure of understanding. And I think what you can see here is that the patients are spread out. And so the message here is just because they have Alzheimer's doesn't mean they can't understand the information. In fact, you see here nearly a third scoring as well as their caregivers on their ability to understand the information about the medication. But you can also see nearly a quarter having absolutely no ability to understand the information. And so the message here is just because they have Alzheimer's doesn't mean they don't understand the information. The message here is because they have Alzheimer's, you have to measure their ability to understand the information because they may score here, they may score there, or they may be in the middle. But you won't know that until you talk to them. Now you can take these interviews and you could give them to experts and have them rate whether the person's competent. And we did that, and we showed here that experts 1 through 3 varied in their judgments of competency, from some being lenient to others being a bit more stringent. And you could come up with a consensus here such that you said, well, 2 out of 3 agree, that'll define someone as competent. And what I'm trying to show you here is that you can take that overall judgment of competency and map it back to the thing that Charlie and I have been talking about, which is cognition, cognitive impairment. God bless, with 2 cheers for the mini-mental, you can show here in people with Alzheimer's disease that their score on the mini-mental does track to the judgment of competency. But again, not all the folks with a mini-mental greater than 24 are judged competent, and not all the people even with a mini-mental in the range of moderate stage dementia are judged not competent. In particular, these folks with mild stage disease, defined by mini-mental in Alzheimer's, very particular, you can see here a third of them are judged competent. So the point is this: if you simply look at the mini-mental state exam score, you might increase or decrease the odds that the person is going to be competent to make a decision. Judged to have adequate capacity, I view those 2 concepts as synonymous: competent, adequate capacity. But it only increases or decreases the odds of that judgment. It isn't determinative. Moreover, think about it. Would you really think from a dignitary perspective that it is appropriate to simply get a measure of cognition and decide on that basis alone that someone can or can't make a decision, even if I could give you a measure of cognition that is so accurate as to be efficient? I think most of us, out of just a dignitary perspective, would say you ought to talk to the person and find out what they do and don't know. Moreover, they may make mistakes that could be corrected. I talked a lot about cognition and its impact on capacity. I want to talk a little bit now about social cognition, that other bit I mentioned in that graph that Nate Sprung created, that chart. This is a very interesting study that asked older adults who at the time of the interview were free of evidence of cognitive impairment. They might have had cognitive aging, but they didn't have cognitive impairment. from MC at a level of either MCI or dementia. And it's a tough slide to read given the font size, but these were self-reported answers to questions like, I answer the telephone whenever it rings, even if I don't know who's calling. And these answers are the number of people who endorse that statement, if you will, incorrectly. In other words, you ought not to answer the telephone if you don't know who's calling, if you have caller ID. So the point was that these various questions, like, if something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. The more people answered them in a way that suggested they didn't have good judgment around scams and fraud, the more likely they were, this is not a very good graph, it's more numbers, but the more likely they were later on to be diagnosed with MCI or dementia. Meaning, lack of awareness around scams, impairments in social cognition were predictive of subsequent diagnoses of either a mild cognitive impairment, inefficiencies in cognition, or dementia. Showing that these changes in social cognition that occur can be just as significant in terms of risks for developing cognitive impairment as cognitive impairment itself. So back to Arthur Packel and Rene Packel. Remember, his earliest signs and symptoms were trouble managing finances. His overall performance on his mini mental was really quite normal, in fact, but it was clear he was experiencing changes. And indeed, this has been shown in studies of individuals with either mild cognitive impairment or dementia. This is a busy, complex, hard to read graph. Just take the photos for pictures for what they're showing you. In the red are people with dementia caused by Alzheimer's. In the yellow are people with mild cognitive impairment caused by Alzheimer's. And the green are individuals who, after rigorous testing, do not have cognitive impairment. These are all older adults. And these are 8 different measures of financial capacity, a very metric measure of financial capacity. And I hope what you can see is, no surprise, individuals who have dementia uniformly score poorer on the various measures of financial capacity. These are 2 measures of time. And so people with impairment in cognition take more time to do the tasks. And there's no surprise, people without impairments in cognition generally do well on these measures of financial capacity. Challenge, I think, that you can see here is the folks with MCI are caught in the middle. They have some impairments, even though they have criteria for dementia. All right, where's the field going? Where do we see the future? Well, some disease before you have mild cognitive impairment or dementia, because a scan like this shows you have evidence of the pathology, and this is a scan that shows the pathology of amyloid in the brain of a living human. Someday we'll be able to diagnose these diseases before you have MCI or dementia. And in that new world where we define these diseases by biomarkers, we have to think about the opportunities and the challenges around detecting impairments in function early, as well as the threats to privacy and autonomy from monitoring. This is a complicated graph. It's a correlation matrix that simply correlates measures of amyloid with a lot of other measures in these humans. And I highlight the circled area here in this next graph to show you how amyloid concentration in the brain of these individuals who are cognitively unimpaired correlated with their scores on financial capacity, meaning you're already beginning to pick up changes in financial capacity as more amyloid was accumulated, showing the future of a brain that's monitored and detected early on for having risk factors for developing cognitive impairment. Well, what might that future look like? This is a graph depicting individuals who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or related diseases in the medical record using Medicare data claims. And this line right here, the vertical line, is the moment in their medical record when that diagnosis appeared. What's depicted on the x-axis with those little jittery lines that go across, like a centipede, is a measure of this many hundreds of thousands of older adults' performance isn't the right word, assessments of their credit scores. The fact that the lines are above 0 means that their credit scores were variable and changing greater than chance. So what I hope you can see is that in the years of diagnosis in the medical record, people were already showing changes in their credit scores. They were already showing troubles for managing their finances that showed up by worsening credit reports, things like payments on credit card bills, loans, and things like that. And so the message here is that long before a physician finally put the diagnosis in the medical record, the credit industry was picking up the problem. You can see after the diagnosis, sadly, how the problem only continues. And so the message here is a rather provocative one. The message here is that it's all very well to come to me with a complaint of 2 to 3 years of disabling cognitive problems that you're worried about. Those problems have been picked up now, arguably years and months before, by other systems in our society. And so I think we have to begin to envision a future world where it's not just me and my scans and my colleagues and my scans detecting problems in the medical sphere, but it's industries and services like the banking and professional investment advisors, the automobile industry and our use of our cars that are picking up changes in our cortical function. And so let me read to you, this is from the AARP's Bank Safe report of 2016, examples of how some industries have recognized both the challenges as well as the opportunities of detecting cognitive impairment. This is a United Kingdom-based banking organization called the Coventry Building Society. The Coventry Building Society offers a service to monitor accounts for financial fraud and exploitation. The bank's software identifies a transaction that's unusual for the customer because of its size, timing, location. So for example, someone using an electronic transfer to a bank they've never done before, never even done an electronic transfer, or using a bank card when they've never used their bank card, or using the bank card at 3 in the morning when they've never used the bank card anywhere other than 1 in the afternoon, etc. Anyway, the customer's contacted and asked to confirm the transaction. While speaking to the customer, the staff of the branch or call center raised the issue of fraud in a sensitive way. For example, by saying, "We would like you to be," and artists sometimes use the following technique, and then they describe what they've observed in their electronic monitoring system. If you feel you may have been affected by the situation, please call us back. The suspected transaction is delayed for a few hours within the legal time limit to allow time for the customer to reflect on the anti-fraud message. Experience shows that many customers realize within a few hours that they've been subjected to fraud and call back to cancel the transaction. What I like about this example is it's a combination of technology, artificial intelligence, if you will, probably, that has figured out sort of thresholds for detecting transactions that should be flagged, because you can't sit there and monitor every transaction as a human that comes through a bank, a busy bank. But then humans are needed. Humans step in after it's flagged, and humans make the phone call. Humans relate the problem, or humans are on the other end if there's further discussion. And finally, the law, you all are active here, namely the legal limit with which one can hold a transaction until finally it has to be released and executed. And so I think this is a good example of how the challenges that we face going forward of dealing with aging brains that are at risk of making mistakes or being victims of fraud or exploitation are not simply problems that my colleagues and I in medicine are going to solve, or that you all in the law and law enforcement are going to solve, or banking and finance, but that we're going to solve together. I hope, though, that what you've learned from my talk is that we're able to diagnose and detect these problems early, both by clinical interviews and using technologies such as biomarker measures. Since 1970, when my colleague, Dr. Demi, wrote that condemnatory article about informed consent, that we have made great progress. We now have ways we respect individuals' autonomy, and we have ways to assess their decisional abilities. That assessments of decisional abilities are entirely distinct from assessments of cognition, but of course they are related. As in cognitive impairment increases one's likelihood they may have impairments in decisional ability. But you only know that someone has impaired capacity if you assess their capacity to do the particular task at hand. And so I want to thank you for this opportunity to give you an update on advances made in the field. Again, it's a real pleasure. And if you want to learn more about me and what I've done and my book and whatnot, there's a website to visit, etc. So thank you very, very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason, and to you, Charlie, for helping to frame our discussion for the next few days. At this time, we're going to take a brief break, and we will resume with our next panel starting at 2:25 Eastern. So we hope you will resume and join us back then. Thanks so much. See you shortly.